Welcome to The Lead from New Lines magazine. I'm Amie Ferris Rotman, and this is a podcast where we delve into the biggest ideas, events, and personalities from around the world. We are approaching the one-year anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. On February 24th, Russian forces entered Ukraine by land, air, and sea, sparking the worst conflict Europe has witnessed since World War II. With me today is Olesya Khromeychuk, a Ukrainian historian, theatre maker, and director of the Ukrainian Institute London. In her book, The Death of a Soldier Told by His Sister, she tells the story of her brother Volodya, who was killed on the front line in eastern Ukraine in 2017. Olesya, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Amie.
First of all, I wanted to say that I was very moved by your memoir. It's a lovely book. It was first published in 2021, updated in 2022 to include your thoughts on the current invasion. And I found it such a personal, beautiful, and quite lyrical tribute to your brother. I was also really touched by, in your prologue, where you write that his death and the battle he was fighting was largely unnoticed by people in Western Europe. And of course, now everyone in the world knows about the war in Ukraine and about Russia's hostilities and what's happening. How has it been for you to see and now know that thousands, maybe tens of thousands of sisters are going through what you went through?
Thank you so much for that question, and also for your very kind words about the book. It always means so much to me to hear the reader's response, and how the book speaks to people in different ways. So thanks for that. Yeah, so the first version of the book, when I wrote it originally, I wrote it in order to try and raise awareness about this forgotten war. At the time, it was entirely forgotten. Whenever I spoke about the war in eastern Ukraine, and occupation of Crimea, people were surprised that it's still, a topic for discussion, that the war was still ongoing, that people were still being killed at the front line, both military and civilians. So for me, it was really, really important to both process my own trauma through writing, the trauma that my family was going through, but also to raise awareness about this war, and through this universal story, try and get people to pay more attention about what was going on. At the end of Europe, that doesn't get an awful lot of news coverage. Normally, regularly. When I was updating the edition before the publication of the second edition, so after the start of the full-scale invasion, I guess I really wanted to try and reflect on why it took a full-scale war for the world to actually discover Ukraine, why it took, the decision of the Kremlin to try and destroy the country for the rest of us to actually realize that the country exists, that it has its own identity, a very clear sense of self, that it has enormous, diverse literature that we've completely dismissed for many, many years, and also why it took such scale of human loss for the political leadership to finally begin to understand what Russia is, that Russia is capable of inflicting that kind of brutal attack, aggression on another sovereign state, something that was entirely dismissed for the first 8 years of this war. And another reason for me to and another reason I had for the updated sections that I wrote for the second edition of the book was to try and encourage all of us to think how the situational interest that emerged in Ukraine can be turned into structural changes, so that in the future, we don't go back to business as usual and start ignoring places like Ukraine and focus again on imperial centers like Moscow, but we actually keep them in mind as places that have so much to offer, that have such valuable knowledge to share with the rest of the world, the sort of knowledge that has been dismissed for far too long.
Do you ever feel angry that it took this long for the world to pay attention?
I think there's a mix of complicated feelings that I feel. I suppose sense of responsibility too, because I am part of the international community. I haven't lived in Ukraine for more than 2 decades, so I also take responsibility for the way we've communicated information about Ukraine in academia, outside of academia, to general public. Yeah, sense of frustration for sure. The sense of, as one of my colleagues put it, of being a sort of one of modern day Cassandras, and there were many of us, when we were talking about something that we knew was happening, that was of vital importance for the world to notice, but the world didn't want to notice. But I think the most important thing for me now is to see how we can correct our mistakes, and how we can ensure that we don't repeat them in the future.
Yes, I noticed a lot of people now are talking about something that you mentioned and wrote about in your book, which is the international community's insistence on expressing, quote, deep concern, and then effectively doing nothing, or actually continuing to trade with Russia and to treat Russia as an equal player, therefore encouraging Moscow's actions. How do we make sure that this stage of deep concern does not return, that we do make sure that things change?
This is a very good question. I think one thing for us to realize now is inaction is not a neutral decision. By not doing something in response to violation of international law, as Russia violated it by occupying Crimea and beginning aggression in eastern Ukraine, by not responding to it appropriately, we have enabled the escalation. And I think it's very important for political leadership to reflect on those first 8 years, and to also take responsibility for that inaction and for the decisions that were taken and not taken in response to Russia's actions. So I think once that soul searching happens, it will be a lot easier for us to respond appropriately now, because even a year into full-scale war, there's still so many delays with the provision of help that is absolutely necessary for Ukraine, economic, humanitarian, but most importantly, military help that Ukrainians keep asking for. And it is being delivered, but it is being delivered with delays. And each such delay results in absolutely unnecessary loss of life.
What are these delays about, in your opinion? I mean, I know what they're about officially. I mean, do you think this is something that's left over from the Soviet era, about the West being afraid of engaging with a nuclear-armed Russia, or is it something much bigger than that?
Perhaps this question should be directed to those people who take those decisions and cause those delays. In my view, part of it was this desire to appease Moscow. And I would like to think that now it's very clear that appeasement doesn't work with Moscow, that it creates the opposite outcome, because appeasement is perceived as a sign of weakness, and it actually encourages escalation in the long run. Part of it, I think, is response to Russia's nuclear blackmail that it's been using very successfully against the rest of the world. And again, here we need to think whether we want to reward war criminal for committing war crimes. But that is how I see one of the reasons several reasons for the delays. I suppose another reason was not perceiving Ukrainian voice as a credible voice, not trusting it with its own experience. I think that is changing now, but it's taken a lot of time and an awful lot of loss for Ukrainians for it to change, and for Ukrainian voice to actually be heard as a credible voice.
You talked about being part of the international community, and I'd like to think back to 24th of February 2022, the day that Russian forces rolled across the border. Do you remember where you were when it happened? Were you in London?
Yes, I'll never forget that night, as I'm sure all Ukrainians will remember it. And relive it in their worst nightmares. I was in London. I was awake. I was finishing an article that I was supposed to submit by the morning. I had come back from a rally outside of the Russian embassy, and I was working. So because I was awake at 3 o'clock in the morning, I actually saw the start of the full-scale invasion sort of unfold live, mostly through my Twitter feed. Journalists who were based in Kyiv at the time were tweeting saying that the explosion started, that they could hear the explosions right, behind them. And my immediate response was to get in touch with those people my friends who I knew were in Ukraine at the time, wake them up, and also those who had families in Kyiv and elsewhere in Ukraine to tell them that, as we put it, it started. That phrase that was being used at the time. It started, and so they can put arrangements in place to try and get people into safety and so on. I described this moment in one of the chapters of the book, the chapter that's called "The Enemy." It was a difficult night. It was nowhere near as difficult as it was for the people who were in Ukraine. But what I remember most about that night is, after the moment of shock came the desire to be as efficient as possible, to put all my efforts into making sure that the world understands what this war is about, that it finally wakes up from this sort of slumber that we've lived in for 8 years and helps Ukraine, first of all, defend itself efficiently, but also win the war as quickly as it is possible.
It must have felt quite surreal for you, especially after losing your brother.
Not necessarily, because we were all prepared for an escalation. We expected it to happen. My brother was the first one who warned me of it when he returned to the front line after his first deployment. I was sort of urging him to try and give civilian life a go again. But he said, you don't understand it. This was 2017. He said, you don't understand. This is a European war that happened to start in eastern Ukraine. He was absolutely certain that it was going to escalate. And frankly, all of my veteran friends said the same thing. It was just a matter of time. But we were preparing for some kind of escalation. Perhaps few of us were ready for the scale of brutality that we did see perpetrated by the Russian troops once they staged the full-scale invasion.
And I must say, the performance of the Ukrainian military, but also the reaction by Ukraine as a whole, its defiance, its resilience, has completely amazed the international community, the world at large. And I mean, as an historian, I would love to hear a little bit about the historical context of this moment, if you could. I mean, to me, it feels like there's been hundreds of years of oppression and repression of Ukrainian culture by Moscow. And this has now burst into the open with this extremely violent invasion.
Yes, the fact that the world was surprised to see this defiance, for me, served as evidence that the world didn't really know an awful lot about Ukraine, because it shouldn't have been surprising to see the people of Ukraine to be defiant and resilient in a situation where essentially, another state is depriving them from their agency, subjectivity, their ability to build the state, independent state, which they chose in 1991, but also, of course, the generations before that fought to have. To deny their desire to build democratic, prosperous future, and they were not going to have any of it. They were not going to allow the Russian troops to to force them into occupation that we've already seen for 8 years in parts of eastern Ukraine and in Crimea, where your rights are completely disrespected. Human rights are not respected at all, where, anybody could be abducted, could be jailed, could be kidnapped, your business, your flat can be taken away, and so on. So, of course, Ukrainians had a lot to lose, and they were prepared to fight for their statehood, for the country, and for the future that they imagined for Ukraine. And you're right. This is based not just on the recent history, the last just over 30 years of renewed independence, and especially the last 9 years since the Maidan revolution, where Ukrainians really, demonstrated their choice very, very clearly, that they wanted to move away from close ties with Russia and suddenly towards Europe, and they would not tolerate authoritarian regimes. But it is also based on several centuries of knowing how repressive Moscow is towards those who rebel against its oppressive rule, and based on the sort of culture that shapes Ukrainians into who they are. Defiant culture that values freedom above everything else.
So that actually brings me to my next question, which is about the Ukrainian Institute, a charity in London of which you are the director. So it was established in the 1970s under very different circumstances when the Soviet Union was officially atheist, and it had a Christian background. Can you tell me a little bit about what you're working with now?
Yes, I will start with the 1970s, as you mentioned, because that's when it was set up by Archbishop Joseph Slipy, and I frequently think back to that moment to seek encouragement in that moment, because this is someone who suffered repression. By the Soviet authorities. He was in the Gulag. He came out of the Gulag, and he decided to set up these centers for, the study of Ukraine around the world. And London was one of those centers in the 1970s. So before it was obvious that the Soviet Union was going to collapse. So this is a man who had a vision, a powerful vision of the future in which the Soviet Union would no longer exist and Ukraine would exist, and people would be interested in learning about Ukraine. And it's that power of that vision that inspires me today, and reminds me that it's really, really important at the moment to think of the future far beyond our lives and far beyond the horrors that we are witnessing at the moment, because I guess that is how we will that future into being. So in some ways, the mission of the institute hasn't really changed since those days. Its purpose is to tell people about Ukraine. But I suppose what's changed, especially over the last year, is the scale of work that we do. We've noticed that people are really hungry for knowledge about Ukraine, the sort of knowledge that is both accessible and reliable. And that is what we're trying to offer. We also focusing on building bridges. So what I mentioned earlier, trying to turn this situational interest into structural change to enable institutions here in the UK and institutions in Ukraine, but also individuals to establish connections that will bring results in the future, to work more closely together, to get to know each other really well. And we're also aiming to shape the conversation about Ukraine. So often over the last year, I was being asked very similar questions by journalists that were based essentially on Kremlin propaganda. While the journalists were trying to debunk that propaganda, they were still referring to the same statements that were issued, say, by Putin, like something like Putin says that Ukrainians are not a real nation. Is there any truth in that? And at some point, I realized that we need to ask different questions. So that is what the institute is trying to do. We try to create a space where new questions can be asked about Ukraine that will actually reveal more about what Ukraine is, rather than how Russia is getting it wrong, if you see what I mean. And of course, we're delighted to see a huge increase in the desire to learn the Ukrainian language, Ukrainian literature, Ukrainian history. So we've been offering those courses as well, and they're doing really well. And since the arrival of Ukrainians displaced by this war, we've also been offering English language classes to displaced Ukrainians too. So a huge expansion of the work of the Institute at the moment.
And with this interest by people in the West to learn Ukrainian language and to learn about Ukrainian literature, are we also seeing fresh translations of Ukrainian authors in the midst of this war?
We are, and I'm really delighted to see that. I've always championed translations of Ukrainian literature, both classics and contemporary, fantastic contemporary literature, and I can finally see that happening at the moment. So yes, definitely keep an eye out on new titles. I mean, the one I'm really excited about is Lesya Ukrainka, Fadesiekle writer. Her Cassandra play has just been recently translated by Nina Murray and has been published by Harvard University. So do get your copy of it as soon as you can. But also fantastic translations of works by Serhiy Zhadan, by Olena Styashkina, contemporary writers, Oksana Zabushko and others. And a lot of those specifically discuss Russia's war in Ukraine and are very recent, discuss very recent experiences. So again, if you want to learn about Ukraine and about how Ukrainians are experiencing this war, this is an excellent way to do so.
Absolutely. I look forward to those. And it leads us to my next question, which is about what I believe we're witnessing right now, definitely in Ukraine, but in other countries that once formed the Soviet Union, which is this decolonization, which seems to be happening in the former Soviet space. By decolonization, I mean ridding the Russian dominance over countries that were once in its sphere of influence. I mean, would you agree with this? Is this even an accurate description to call it this?
Yes. Again, this is something that should have happened a long time ago. I mean, let's remember that when the empires collapsed in the aftermath of the First World War, the Russian Empire did collapse, but the Soviet Union managed to regain control of most of the territories and essentially functioned as an empire itself, although it pretended not to be a repressive empire, of course. But it worked as an empire, totally denying expression of any self-expression to nationalities that it engulfed in its union. So this, and then when the Soviet Union collapsed, this process of decolonization never really happened. In Russia, it started to happen elsewhere. We certainly saw a lot of discussions about the colonial relationship with Moscow in Ukraine in the 1990s. I mean, there are fantastic works by Tamara Hundorova, by Oksana Zabushko, whom I already mentioned, by others that discuss this, but unfortunately they largely went unnoticed, especially by the readers who were not able to read those works in Ukrainian. Again, this is coming back to the question of translation, what is made available to readership outside of Ukraine. So this is now a renewed discussion of decolonization in Ukraine, which I think is a necessary discussion to be had, and one that I think is going to have influence elsewhere as well. I feel slightly uncomfortable using this term post-Soviet space or former Soviet space because it's probably not the most helpful description of a very, very large region with very different national groups that are simply being lumped together because of their colonial relationship with Moscow. So we're defining them through their oppressive past. Maybe now it's time to drop that description of the region.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I'm often searching for new ways to describe countries that were under Moscow's influence. What can we call it? Or do you think we should just focus on each country as an individual country?
Yeah, I would encourage us to decenter our view of the region and stop focusing on Moscow either as a center of an empire that some observers have admired for a long time, or as a repressive center of the empire. Let's decenter our focus. Let's shine light on those cultures that have been left behind for so long. I think if we want to decolonize our own understanding of the region, that is the first thing we need to do.
Just going to talk about something a little bit different here, which I'm very interested in, and I've heard you talk about before, which is the changing gender dynamics in Ukraine as a result of Russia's invasion. I'm really interested in this because, well, I'm a woman, but also because this is something I've reported on, and something which is very much at odds with a lot of the stereotypes that people have about Ukraine. And so what we're seeing is a complete shift, correct me if I'm wrong, on the ground about women joining the military. We're seeing women become heads of households. We're seeing more women in government. Do you think that this shift is something that will permanently change Ukraine for the future and for the good?
Thank you for that question. I will give you an example of what is happening in the Ukrainian armed forces, because that is something I've been monitoring for some time. I mean, essentially since 2014, I tried to study participation of women in the Ukrainian armed forces. At the moment, there are 60,000 women in the Ukrainian armed forces, and 41,000 of those are service women. The rest are civilians working for the armed forces, and around 5,000 are in direct combat. And the figures have increased substantially since 2014, but even since the start of the full-scale invasion. So we can clearly see that women are making a choice to join the armed forces as a way to protect their statehood, as a way to contribute to Ukraine's victory in this war that Russia is waging against them. And for me, one of the most interesting things about this phenomenon is that so much has changed in the way that women experience the service in the armed forces. So when in 2014, quite a lot of them joined the army, their position at the front line was complicated. It was often on a semi-legal basis because so many positions were not open to women. This is a complicated legacy of labor law that was essentially still the legacy of the Soviet labor law. And what they managed to achieve is to explain the problems to society, but also to political leadership, and demand that their rights are improved. So they managed to achieve the first wave of restrictions being lifted in 2016, and then subsequently in different waves since. And now women can join the armed forces in the same way as men can, provided they are qualified to do so. They are trained and qualified to do so. They are not obliged. There is no conscription for women, unlike in the case of men. But should they wish to join the armed forces, they are able to do so based on their professional skills and not being hindered by their gender. And for me, that shows you how much can change in Ukraine. Often these are grassroots changes, pressure from civil society, from groups such as, in this case, a women veterans movement that was very powerful, very vocal, and very persuasive. And the other change, which is very telling, is that the women who have joined the armed forces are not being perceived in gendered ways in the way that they used to be before. So I noticed headlines in 2014, 15, 16 that were highly gendered, that would speak of women as, even women took up arms to defend the country, or she cut her beautiful long hair off and went to the front line, or even in the trenches, she has beautiful manicure, that kind of stuff. You can imagine this sort of tone. Now I don't see those headlines. Now I see women being celebrated and congratulated for their achievements as servicewomen because of their professionalism, in the same way as men are. So for me, that's a wonderful change. And is it going to last? I really hope so. I have good reasons to believe that it is going to last, that we won't see the sort of change to kind of business as usual after victory, after the war has ended, because there will be so many women in society with that experience. And as long as we highlight that experience, I think we will be in a very powerful position to build on that and to ensure gender equality, obviously not just in the armed forces, but in society more widely.
You talked about victory just now and how this war will end. And I wanted to finish by asking you your thoughts on the future. I know you're not a politician, but how does this war actually end? I mean, in your book, you did speak about justice, which I think is missing actually from the discussions we see out there at the moment.
Yes. First of all, I'd like to remind us that it's up to us how quickly it ends. Because Ukrainians have proved it to the rest of the world that they are determined to ensure that they win this war, but they do need our support, economic, humanitarian, military support. And we in our peaceful cities shouldn't just sit back and watch this war as if it's, an episode of drama on TV. We should remember that we also have agency, and we can also exercise that agency in ensuring that the help that is needed for Ukraine to win this war is delivered in a timely manner, and that solidarity, which I think really surprised the Kremlin, solidarity in the democratic world stays strong. And that all of us are just as invested in Ukraine's victory as Ukrainians are. Secondly, yes, of course, victory for me, as for all Ukrainians, means restoration of territorial integrity, including Crimea. Because I often hear people say to me, "Why don't you just surrender parts of parts of your territory that Putin wants to keep?" And it's naive to think that. Rewarding a criminal for the crimes that he's committing will somehow ensure peace. Also, it's important to remember that if Crimea until Crimea is deoccupied, until it is liberated, it will continue being used as a platform to launch further attacks against Ukraine. So actually, delaying the occupation of Crimea is prolonging this war, not ensuring that it finishes sooner. And finally, yes, you're absolutely right. Justice is key to lasting peace. Because until there's justice, until war criminals are punished, until there are reparations, there will not be any possibility to see this peace last. And again, here we can all contribute to ensuring that justice is administered, and that war criminals are punished.
This year will be the first anniversary of the invasion, but next year, 2024, will mark another very sad anniversary, an entire decade of Russia's military aggression in Ukraine. This is a painfully long time to be fighting, and it's no small thing that Ukrainians have managed to hold on to both their hopes and their values during these 10 years. Do you ever worry that the toll of the war will ever become so great that even Ukrainians, lose sight of that?
Ukrainians have no choice but to win this war, because the alternative is not the one that we can accept. And I think it's very important that the rest of us don't succumb to war fatigue or Ukraine fatigue. To be fair, I haven't seen examples of that wherever I travel. I mean, I just returned from Australia. I've been to the States just before that. I travel around continental Europe quite a lot. And I see overwhelming and very touching support of the general population for Ukraine and investment in Ukrainian victory, which encourages, for sure, encourages people like me, but it also encourages people in Ukraine to keep on fighting. I guess what I would like to ask all of us to think is what sort of future we want for the democratic world as a whole, and remember that freedom is fragile. We saw it threatened in Ukraine by an aggressive neighboring state. So, in order to protect the freedoms that we enjoy in the democratic world, we need to make sure that we support Ukraine, and that we help it win this war as soon as possible, because it has implications for all of us wherever we are in the world. I am optimistic at the moment in terms of seeing this solidarity around the world last. I feel that there's now that Ukraine has been discovered, it is also inspiring all of us to think hard about what sort of future we want to live in and what we are prepared to sacrifice for freedom.
I feel like that's a very good point for us to end this Olesya Khromeychuk, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me and for discussing Ukraine.
This has been The Lead by New Lines Magazine. You can find Olesya on Twitter at @Khromeychuk and buy her book, The Death of a Soldier Told by His Sister, at all good bookshops. This week's episode was produced by Joshua Martin and hosted by me, Amie Ferris Rotman. Thank you all for joining us.